At night, the Korean Peninsula tells two very different stories. In the south, cities blaze with light, technology, and prosperity, a nation ranked among the richest in the world. But just across the border, darkness covers almost everything. This is North Korea, once more industrialized than its southern neighbor, now one of the poorest nations on Earth. How did this happen? How did a country that began with strong industry, vast natural resources, and Soviet support collapse into famine, isolation, and poverty, while South Korea rose to become a global economic powerhouse? In the 1960s, North Korea's economy was stronger than South Korea's. Its factories produced steel, chemicals, and weapons, while its southern neighbor relied heavily on foreign aid. Yet today, South Korea's GDP is more than 50 times larger. One side embraced openness, trade, and innovation. The other chose isolation, military buildup, and total state control. This is the paradox of North Korea, a regime that pours billions into nuclear weapons while millions of its people struggle to find food. A nation where the ruling elite live in luxury, while ordinary citizens rely on black markets to survive. This is not just the story of poverty. It is the story of choices, of control, and of a people trapped by history. Korea's modern history was shaped by outsiders. From 1910 to 1945, the Korean Peninsula was a colony of Imperial Japan. For 35 years, the Japanese Empire exploited Korea's resources and people, seizing farmland, building factories, and suppressing Korean culture. Millions of Koreans were forced into labor, and thousands of women were taken as comfort women for the Japanese military. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, ending World War II, Korea was suddenly free but also vulnerable. With no unified leadership, the Allies rushed to secure the peninsula. The United States and the Soviet Union, already emerging as Cold War rivals, divided Korea along the 38th parallel. The Soviets took control of the north, while the Americans occupied the south. Neither intended this division to be permanent, but both saw Korea as strategically vital. For the Soviets, it was a buffer against U.S. influence in Asia. For the Americans, it was a front line to contain communism. It was in this power vacuum that Kim Il-sung emerged. Born in 1912, he had fought as a guerrilla against Japanese forces in Manchuria and later fled to the Soviet Union, where he received training and support. In 1945, with Stalin's backing, Kim returned to Korea as a Soviet-chosen leader. At just 33 years old, he became the head of the new North Korean government, presenting himself as both a revolutionary hero and a man of the people. In its earliest years, North Korea looked like the stronger half of the divided nation. With Soviet aid and heavy industry left behind by Japan, Pyongyang's economy surged. By the early 1960s, North Korea's per capita GDP was estimated to be twice that of South Korea's. Its steel mills, chemical plants, and military factories made it one of the most industrialized countries in Asia outside of Japan. The state provided free education and healthcare. Infrastructure projects, from hydroelectric dams to collective farms, were hailed as socialist triumphs. Kim Il-sung's Juche ideology, self-reliance, gave North Korea an identity separate from both Soviet communism and American capitalism. But in 1950, Kim Il-sung launched a surprise invasion of the South, aiming to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. Backed by Soviet tanks and later Chinese troops, North Korean forces swept south until US and UN forces intervened. The war raged for 3 brutal years, destroying cities and killing millions. It was said that an estimated 10 to 15% of North Korea's population died. When the armistice was signed in 1953, the border returned almost exactly where it began, but the scars were permanent. For Kim Il-sung, the war justified militarization and total control. For the North, it deepened isolation and dependence on communist allies. From that moment on, security became the regime's religion. In the decades following its early economic success, North Korea faced a critical choice: open up to the world like its southern neighbor, or tighten control in the name of independence. Kim Il-sung chose the latter. By the late 1960s, while South Korea under President Park Chung-hee was beginning to open its economy to foreign investment and export-led growth, North Korea doubled down on self-reliance, or Juche. Foreign trade became limited and tightly controlled. Private enterprise was outlawed. Every factory, farm, and mine answered to the state. What began as a philosophy of national independence evolved into a doctrine of control. It told citizens that isolation was strength, obedience was patriotism, and poverty was sacrifice. At first, this central planning appeared effective. Heavy industry grew, and North Korea maintained one of the largest militaries in Asia. But the rigid system had flaws. Productivity lagged behind. Unlike South Korea, which embraced innovation and partnerships with companies like Hyundai and Samsung, North Korea failed to adapt to the rapidly modernizing global economy. The real test came in the 1970s and 1980s. North Korea borrowed heavily from Western banks to finance ambitious industrial projects. But poor planning and inefficiency meant many of these projects failed to deliver returns. By 1980, North Korea had accumulated $4 billion in foreign debt, an enormous sum for the time. By 1987, it defaulted on nearly all loans, effectively cutting itself off from international credit markets. Meanwhile, South Korea surged ahead. In 1970, both North and South Korea had similar GDP per capita levels, roughly $250 to $300 US. By 1990, South Korea's GDP per capita had soared to $6,500, while North Korea's stagnated at around $1,000. The gap had widened almost sevenfold. Isolation became not just a policy, but a prison. Kim Il-sung's regime controlled all media, banned foreign culture, and sealed the borders. Even Soviet-style reforms like those seen in China under Deng Xiaoping were rejected. Instead, resources flowed into the military. By the late 1980s, North Korea was spending 20 to 25% of its GDP on defense, one of the highest rates in the world, leaving little for food, technology, or consumer needs. The closed door brought short-term control but long-term decay. While the South welcomed global markets, North Korea withdrew into secrecy and stagnation. The 1990s were the darkest decade in North Korea's history. The closed-door policies of Kim Il-sung had already weakened the economy, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, North Korea lost its most critical ally. Moscow had supplied Pyongyang with cheap oil, machinery, and food imports. Almost overnight, these lifelines disappeared. North Korea's state-run farms and factories depended on Soviet fuel and spare parts. Without them, agricultural output plummeted. By 1993, grain production had fallen below 5 million tons, far short of the 7 to 8 million tons needed to feed the population. Floods in 1995 and 1996, followed by drought in 1997, devastated the harvests even further. The result was catastrophic. Between 1994 and 1998, North Korea experienced what it called the Arduous March, a nationwide famine. Independent estimates suggest that 600,000 to 1 million people died, though some sources argue the toll may have reached 2 to 3 million. Entire villages withered away. Families survived on grass, bark, and even insects. Reports from defectors described children fainting in classrooms and workers collapsing on factory floors from hunger. Meanwhile, survival for many came through the black market known as jangmadang. Women in particular became breadwinners by selling food, clothing, or smuggled Chinese goods. These underground markets, illegal but tolerated by the state, became a lifeline for millions, and would later transform North Korea's society in unexpected ways. In 1995, South Korea's GDP per capita stood at over $12,000, while North Korea's had collapsed to less than $1,000. Satellite images from the late 1990s told the story in one frame, the South glowing brightly at night while the North remained almost entirely dark. The Arduous March revealed the full cost of isolation. A nation that once promised prosperity and equality had become a land of hunger and silence. The famine of the 1990s should have been the end of North Korea's system. Millions were starving, state farms had collapsed, and the promise of socialism lay in ruins. Yet, against all odds, the regime survived. How? By reinventing control. In 1994, North Korea's founding leader Kim Il-sung died at the age of 82, marking the end of an era. His son, Kim Jong-il, formally took power. After Kim Jong-il assumed full power in 1994, he embraced the Songun, or military-first policy. The logic was clear. As long as the army stayed loyal, the regime would endure. Resources flowed to the military, not the people. By the early 2000s, North Korea was spending over 20% of its GDP on defense, one of the highest rates in the world. Soldiers ate while civilians scoured the countryside for grass and tree bark. At the same time, the state tolerated something it once condemned: markets. The collapse of the rationing system forced people to rely on the jangmadang, informal street markets. These began with food bartering during the famine, but quickly expanded. By the mid-2000s, there were hundreds of such markets across the country, selling everything from rice and corn to Chinese DVDs and South Korean cosmetics. For many families, survival depended not on the government, but on these underground economies. The regime, however, never lost sight of control. When markets grew too powerful, the state cracked down. In 2009, a surprise currency reform wiped out people's savings overnight, sparking rare protests. The government quickly backtracked, proving that even in an authoritarian state, the pressure of survival could not be ignored. North Korea also turned to illicit activities to sustain itself. Counterfeit US dollars, narcotics production, arms sales, and later cyber attacks became crucial sources of foreign currency. According to the United Nations, North Korean hacking groups like the Lazarus Group stole an estimated $2 billion through cybercrime between 2015 and 2019. Money funneled into weapons programs. By the early 2000s, the country had adapted into a strange paradox, a socialist dictatorship that relied on black markets, smuggling networks, and cybercrime to keep itself afloat. For ordinary people, life was about navigating between survival and repression. For the regime, it was about maintaining absolute power while bending the rules of its own system. North Korea did not recover by opening up. It recovered by tightening its grip, militarizing society, and exploiting secrecy. Survival came not from reform, but from control. As Soviet support vanished, one ally remained: China. Though Beijing had embraced market reforms, it continued to supply Pyongyang with food, fuel, and trade, not out of ideology but to prevent regime collapse on its border. This uneasy partnership became North Korea's last connection to the outside world. As North Korea struggled through famine and isolation, the rest of the world moved forward, none more dramatically than its southern neighbor. South Korea transformed itself into one of Asia's four tigers, alongside Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG became global giants. The country hosted the 1988 Seoul Olympics, entered the OECD in 1996, and by the early 2000s emerged as a global cultural power with the rise of K-pop and Korean cinema. Meanwhile, North Korea remained frozen in time. Its infrastructure crumbled, its technology lagged decades behind, and its people had little access to electricity, information, or consumer goods. International sanctions imposed after its first nuclear test in 2006 deepened the isolation. While South Korea was building the world's fastest internet networks, North Korea was restricting its citizens to a closed intranet, sealed off from the global web. If there is one defining feature of modern North Korea, it is this: a poor nation that spends like a superpower on weapons. While its people face hunger, the regime pours its scarce resources into missiles, nuclear programs, and the military. This is the paradox, the price of power. After the famine of the 1990s, Kim Jong-il realized that nuclear weapons could be more valuable than food or factories. In a world where North Korea had little to offer, nuclear capability became its bargaining chip for survival. By the early 2000s, Pyongyang withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in 2006, it tested its first nuclear bomb. Since then, North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests and launched more than 200 ballistic missiles, some capable of reaching the United States. The costs have been enormous. For a country with an economy worth less than $30 billion in 2020, smaller than that of many mid-sized cities, this level of military spending is staggering. The consequences are felt daily by ordinary citizens. Food insecurity remains chronic. According to the United Nations, nearly 40% of North Koreans are undernourished today. Rural hospitals lack basic medicines, while military parades showcase intercontinental ballistic missiles. Yet, for the regime, weapons are not just about defense, they are about leverage. Each missile launch forces the world to pay attention. Each nuclear test brings Pyongyang back to the negotiating table, often in exchange for aid, fuel, or sanctions relief. Nuclear power has become North Korea's shield, sword, and bargaining chip. Meanwhile, the ruling elite enjoys the privileges of this system. Luxury cars, imported liquor, and foreign technology flow into Pyongyang, even under sanctions, while ordinary families trade potatoes in black markets. In December 2011, North Korea's longtime leader Kim Jong-il died after 17 years in power. Within days, his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, took power, continuing the Kim family dynasty. North Korea is a country of contradictions. Once a rising industrial power, it is now one of the poorest nations in the world. Its people face chronic hunger, lack of healthcare, and limited freedoms. Yet the regime maintains nuclear weapons, a massive military, and the loyalty of an elite few. The story of North Korea is the story of choices: isolation over openness, control over innovation, and military might over welfare. Each decision that ensured the survival of the regime came at a devastating cost to its citizens. While South Korea, China, and Vietnam embraced reform and globalization, North Korea remained frozen in time. Yet, paradoxically, this same system has preserved the regime against internal collapse and foreign pressure. In 2019, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made a rare move on the world stage, meeting with then US President Donald Trump in a series of high-profile summits, first in Singapore, then in Hanoi, raising hopes that decades of hostility might finally ease. Cameras captured historic handshakes and smiles as Kim sought relief from crushing international sanctions in exchange for steps toward denuclearization. But behind the spectacle, negotiations collapsed. Kim refused to fully give up his nuclear arsenal, seeing it as his regime's ultimate guarantee of survival, while the US demanded complete disarmament before lifting sanctions. When talks broke down in Hanoi, Kim returned home, empty-handed. Since then, he has doubled down on missile tests, tightened control over his people, and revived his image as a defiant leader standing against global pressure, showing the world that in North Korea, power still speaks louder than promises. Nuclear weapons, secretive governance, and black market economies have become the pillars of survival. North Korea's history is a warning and a lesson. Power without prosperity may protect a government, but it cannot protect a people. The nation that promised independence, equality, and wealth now exists as a stark study in extremes. A society where survival, control, and fear define every aspect of life. Today, information is the regime's greatest fear. Internet access is restricted to a privileged few. Foreign media is banned, and even owning a South Korean drama can be a death sentence. In recent years, defectors and human rights groups have reported executions for those caught smuggling or watching K-dramas. Stories of freedom and prosperity that the regime cannot allow its people to see. In a world connected by screens and satellites, North Korea fights to keep its citizens in the dark. What do you think? Was Kim Jong-un ever serious about giving up his nuclear weapons? Or was it all a strategy to gain global attention and relief from sanctions? Share your thoughts below. Do you believe North Korea will ever open up to the world? Or will it remain isolated under the Kim family's rule?